Let's see, it's not there. And all right. So welcome back everyone to another episode of kind of our reboot here. The previous program was Connected by Controversy, and I'm changing it over to What's Your Evidence right now, at least. This is Dr. Chris White coming to you from Marshall University in West Virginia. Today with us is Dr. Kathryn Olmsted, professor of history at UC Davis. And my co-host today is Dr. Dan Holbrook, who's been on several programs with me as well to talk about especially a topic that he and I both have in common, which is about conspiracy theories in U.S. history. So welcome, Dr. Olmsted.
Thank you for having me.
Well, both of us discussed your book, Real Enemies, starting a few years ago after Dr. Holbrook actually used it in his course. And both of us just thought it was a really intriguing take on all this. And I have to say that I think as a historian in particular, it's not very common for me to hear conspiracy theorists refer to this broad scope of history enough. But you detail this so well in your book, going back to World War I all the way to 9/11, and establish something that I think is important for everybody to recognize, which is there actually are reasons for people to feel kind of a fear of the government in some cases, but they don't necessarily have all the details for producing that fear. How would you put it?
I would say that the theme of my book is that there have been revelations of real government conspiracies, especially since the 1970s, and that those real conspiracies, the knowledge of those real conspiracies, then feeds the belief that there are more conspiracies that the U.S. government has committed that we just don't know about yet.
Yeah. And so can you kind of give us a sense of how that might be different than what other authors have written about in this, when they talk about conspiracy theories?
Well, I would say that there's a big range of people who write on conspiracy theories. It's an interdisciplinary topic. So there are many people who study conspiracy theories in psychology, who look at individuals and why they are more inclined to believe conspiracy theories. There are philosophers who are interested in the epistemology of the conspiracy theories. There are cultural studies. Oh, I'm so sorry. I was so sure I turned this off.
Yeah.
There are people who study sociology, who are interested in groups and why certain types of people, whether they're racial groups or ethnic groups or religious minorities, why they believe in conspiracy theories. And there's anthropologists who study it, political scientists, of course. So there's not a whole lot of historians, though, and I've never quite understood why that is. I think partly it's because there's a sort of stigma associated with studying conspiracy theories, that people think that if you study conspiracy theories, you must be a conspiracy theorist. You must have always been fascinated by the Kennedy conspiracy theories, or you must think that the CIA is sending you messages through your molars or whatever. And so people, scholars, don't want to be associated with that, and so they shy away from it. They also, I think, believe that conspiracy theories are sloppy, that they are irrational, and that people are twisting evidence. So what's interesting about that? So there's very few historians who study conspiracy theories, and when they do, I think they look strictly at the damaging aspects of conspiracy theories and how this belief in the irrational has led to an irrational kind of politics.
Can I ask how you came to the topic then? Because in my preparation for the first time I taught the class in 2012, it became immediately apparent that very few historians had written anything useful other than you. So can I ask how you came to the topic?
Well, I came to the topic out of my dissertation because I did my dissertation on the Church Committee, which was this special Senate committee headed by Senator Frank Church of Idaho in the mid-1970s after Watergate that looked into crimes, abuses by the CIA, the FBI, and the NSA at the height of the Cold War. So this was a committee that came right after Watergate, and there was that was a peak for congressional interest in uncovering misdeeds by U.S. secret agencies. So before and after, I would say the majority of Congress just didn't want to hear about any misdeeds by the CIA or FBI. But right after Watergate, there was this tremendous appetite in Congress and in the press to learn more. Was Nixon unusual? Was he unique? Or were there other presidents who had ordered similar sorts of secret crimes to be committed by his secret agents? So there was this 1.5 year long investigation. And I wrote my dissertation in the 1990s about an event that had just happened 20 years earlier. So it was a little unusual for a history dissertation. But I became convinced that it was important for understanding modern politics and foreign policy. So I did as much as I could with looking at the extant records and the press coverage and interviewing people. But what I discovered when I went to Senator Church's papers in Idaho is that he had hundreds of letters from people all around the country who had contacted him and said during the investigation, I believe that I was a victim of these crimes that you are uncovering. Most commonly, they believe that they were victims of MK Ultra, the mind control experiments by the CIA. Most of those people, seem to be sort of mentally unstable. But nevertheless, sometimes they had enough information that made it seem plausible. And in addition, there were a lot of people who believed that they had been surveilled by the FBI or by the CIA's illegal domestic spying program. So I got really interested in how these revelations of real government conspiracies fueled conspiracy theories. I didn't do anything with it in the dissertation, which became a book. But then after the book came out, I myself started getting letters like Senator Church had. And it was especially intriguing to me because I could see why they contacted Senator Church. But I was, a part-time lecturer at a university in California. And I had written a book published with University of North Carolina Press. It was not easy to get a hold of. Yet what I discovered is there was a whole subculture out there of people who read everything they could about illegal CIA operations and believed that they were victims. So I started getting fascinated by this, like why would how much of what was current in the 1990s, sort of this zeitgeist of distrust of all authorities, how much of that, I wondered, was due to the revelation of real government conspiracies as opposed to just some sort of irrational moment that we were passing through. So that's when I got interested in it in a nutshell.
That just reminds me of the beginning of your book in the introduction, actually, how you put it pretty bluntly that that there's a reason why people believe that the government is at least thinking about conspiring because of, and then you point to Operation Northwoods. I mean, you start off with 9/11, but then kind of connect it back to Northwoods, and then that ties in with something else that you address in the book, which is that the conspiracists are really referring to the actual government documents themselves, and so there's kind of an irony in there. Do you want to explore that a little bit?
Sure. I mean, I think the best example of this is the Warren Commission report, which was produced by the Special Presidential Commission to study the assassination of John F. Kennedy. And, it's a shelf full of volumes of testimony and exhibits. And it was all made publicly available. And the Warren Commission, of course, determined that Lee Harvey Oswald had acted alone, the lone gunman conclusion, But the conspiracy theorists use the Warren Report, particularly all of its exhibits, all of the evidence that they appended at the end, to then construct theories that they believed undermined the conclusions of the Warren Report. So they used the government documents to prove theories about government conspiracies.
Yeah, just amazing. And actually, I guess this book was published before Philip Sheenan's book came out, A Cruel and Shocking Act, where he goes into the ways in which kind of analyzes how the Warren Commission itself was flawed, but he doesn't come up with an alternative explanation, really. I assume you're familiar with his work.
Yes, I am.
Yeah. Um, and actually, Dan and I talked to him a few months ago too. Yeah. But and you point out some of those elements in your JFK chapter too, that there are things that weren't pursued because it would have been embarrassing, right? And rather than it being evidence of the FBI or the CIA covering up what they did in the JFK assassination plot, then it's really covering up things that they missed that could have maybe prevented it.
Right.
Yeah.
Yes, the FBI in particular, if they had put the puzzle pieces together, might have been able to prevent the assassination, or at least there's a plausible counterfactual there. And
Sure.
so the FBI in particular was very concerned about concealing that information. So as a result, that act of concealment then led people to wonder, well, what else are they covering up?
Yeah.
That sort of brings us to what I think is one of the most important parts of your book. That is the extensive discussion. It's sort of foundational of secrecy in government. And when I used that book in class and when I talked about secrecy in government, most of the students' immediate reaction is that, secrecy is bad. And so we would have these lengthy discussions about, is secrecy incompatible with democracy? Is secrecy inherently bad? And part of the strength of your book in that class was that it seems pretty clear that secrecy is a necessary part of modern government. So maybe you could talk about how secrecy lends itself to conspiracism, but also is part of modern government.
Well,
If
I
you
would.
agree with that is.
Oh, no, I do. I think that if you are going to have a government of a large nation in the nuclear age, you're going to have some secrecy. And the question is, how do you balance that secrecy with democracy? So if you have in your democracy secret agents that are responsible only to the president and go around spying on the president's enemies and reporting back to the president, or testing drugs on unwitting American citizens, or trying to assassinate foreign leaders without any checks at all on the president's desires to do that, or sometimes even the chief of the secret agency's desires to do that, then you're really starting to undermine democracy and undermine the government's credibility once those actions are made public. So you have to figure out a way to balance that. And that's, in a way, what the Church Committee was all about, was trying to figure out a way not to abolish the CIA, but to balance the need for secrecy with democracy, and setting up oversight committees in Congress that the secret agencies needed to report to, so that there would be more eyes on the secret operation. The congressmen were not allowed to broadcast what they learned, but the idea would be that the CIA, the FBI, the NSA would have to answer to some democratically elected representatives besides the president, and that there would be more accountability that way. I mean, the problem was that, of course, those oversight mechanisms were often evaded, but that's what they were trying to do, would be to set up a more accountable system.
Yeah. I had a question and it just disappeared. the attractiveness of secrecy for for some government agencies, maybe for all of them, I think is a major element of this. I mean, it's easier to operate perhaps if you can do things in secret, if you don't have to tell authorities what you're doing. And I mean, I don't know how what oversight might work.
Right. I mean, that is the difficulty, is figuring out how you can act quickly and covertly and still notify, at least a few Democratic overseers. And it is difficult, but I would argue that it is essential to try to set up those sorts of mechanisms, because otherwise you can have events like Watergate occur. You can have the president just ordering government agents to spy at will on his political enemies and then gather intelligence for him. And that's the road to autocracy.
Can't hear you, Chris.
My bad. A great example, as you point out in the Pearl Harbor chapter, is that there are times in which secrecy is essential for preventing the enemy from knowing that you're spying on them. And so, but in the process of trying to of that being revealed, then people just came to the conclusion that, well, he must have known exactly when the attack was going to be. Can you parse through that a little bit?
Sure. Yes. Pearl Harbor is a good example of this. It is a complex situation. But before the Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor on December 7th, 1941, the U.S. government was reading some of the secret messages that were sent to Japanese diplomats all over the world. So not Japanese military commanders, but they had broken the Japanese diplomatic code. And so there were code breakers who were working for the US military who realized that the Japanese were getting ready to attack. And they weren't sure, though, where that attack would come or when it would come. But so as a result, they were not really prepared at Pearl Harbor. The commanders of the Army and the Navy did send warning telegrams to Pearl Harbor and to commanders all over the world, but they weren't sufficiently clear or emphatic enough about the need to take precautions. So as a result, the Pearl Harbor base was caught unprepared, and it was a temporary setback, a disaster for the United States.
I'll be right back. I'm sorry.
Yeah. And to clarify a little bit on that, so there's hundreds of potential targets at that time, right?
Right.
And did you say something in the book? I might have misread it, but that the admiral at Pearl Harbor did get notification that there was a possibility, like just basically like a general notification, like an hour before the attack. Was that true?
Yes. Well, first of all, about 10 days before the attack, he got a warning that said this is to be considered a war warning. A strike by the Japanese is anticipated at any time.
Okay.
So certainly he did have a general warning. And then there were signs right before the attack. There was a Japanese sub that was sighted right outside Pearl Harbor an hour or two before the attack. And also the Army Air Corps radar operators at the north of Oahu saw planes coming in about an hour or two ahead of the attack. So there were, but because they just weren't thinking that way, they just, were not really, they could not believe that the Japanese could pull off something like that. They thought Hawaii was just too far away from Japan, that even when they got this general warning well before the attack and specific warnings an hour before, they still weren't prepared. So it was an intelligence disaster. Obviously, many people made mistakes for that to happen. On the other hand, Franklin Roosevelt, quite understandably, did not want to have a full investigation into that intelligence failure as the war was starting, not only because of reasons of morale, but also because he didn't want the Japanese to know that the United States had broken the diplomatic code. So that
Which
would
is
have
not evidence that he deliberately allowed the attack to happen.
right, exactly. Right. So it was a cover up, but it was a cover up for, really one could argue existential reasons.
It seems similar to the intelligence failures leading up to 9/11 too, right? We knew that bin Laden was determined to attack. That's what the August 6th memo said. But that doesn't mean that we knew how he was going to do it
Right.
and when. Yeah.
Right.
And so how do you prepare for something like that? I mean, in hindsight, of course, yeah, stop, search everybody who has box cutters and knives on and maybe profile certain people who have been to, search if they've been to Afghanistan before or something like that. But we just weren't thinking like that before.
Right.
Wow. And go ahead, Dan.
Nope.
Well, and then of course you go back to even before then. What made you decide to start with World War I?
Well, I think that that's a turning point because it's at that point that the U.S. Government does a couple of things that I think are really significant. One is that Congress passes and the president signs the Espionage and Sedition Acts, which criminalize dissent. And there's a lot of volunteer organizations that enforce that to try and search out for sedition, but there's also government agents. And so the other thing that I think is very significant is the expansion of secret agencies within the government, secret surveillance agencies, government agents who are looking for evidence of sedition or un-American activity. So you have there's a group within the Justice Department that is headed by J. Edgar Hoover that will eventually become part of the Bureau of Investigation and the Federal Bureau of Investigation. There's also a lot of Army surveillance of Americans, particularly African Americans, socialists, lots of groups that oppose the war, oppose U.S. Entry into the war and participation in the war. And so as a result, you have a lot of these people who oppose the war beginning to be paranoid about government surveillance because, of course, they have reasons for their paranoia that there is a lot of government surveillance. And a lot of people do go to prison for opposing the war. So I would argue that it's at that point that you start seeing more and more theories, conspiracy theories about the government is out to get me, as opposed to the Catholics, the Mormons, the Jews are out to get me.
Mm.
Yeah, I agree fully. It's a really important shift from conspiracism being oriented around outsiders coming in to subvert the government to it's the insiders themselves. It is the government itself that is trying to maybe not subvert itself, but certainly attack the rights of the people, attack freedoms and so forth. And I'm fascinated by the consistent use of the language of tyranny and slavery in conspiracy theorizing or conspiracism throughout the entire period of American history. My course started in, with the Pilgrims, basically, or the pre-Pilgrim Virginians. And that language is a consistent strain. And do you see something in the early 20th century that helps to reinforce the idea that the government itself is tending towards tyranny, or that at least people thought that?
Well, I would say that the government is getting bigger, of course. I mean, there starts being an income tax in the 1910s, which makes it possible for the government to get bigger. And there's specifically for conspiracy theorists, they're concerned about military intelligence, which is growing significantly, the military surveillance of Americans in World War I. During the 1920s, there's prohibition, which is a big increase in government power. There's also, of course, immigration restriction, which leads to, more enforcement of the border, bigger government capacity for immigration enforcement. So, I mean, I think we think of the 1920s as being this period where there's laissez-faire, and it's true there's no welfare state, but there is, an increasingly large carceral state and federal law enforcement. And then, of course, in the New Deal, you start getting the foundations of the welfare state, and then it's World War II, the nuclear age. The government just keeps getting bigger and bigger for very good reasons. It's the 20th century. That's how you cope with modern society. However, on the other hand, as the government gets bigger, conspiracy theories tend to focus on the government as the perpetrator of conspiracies against the people. And as you were saying, Dan, there's always been this fear among Americans of tyranny, of being reduced to slavery. And you still have those concerns. It's just the fears are now that the government is the one that is tyrannical.
Yeah, and it's a consistent strain, at least since the revolution, I think, in American political thought that small government is better. And that the growth of government in and of itself is a threat. So, and it's one to be resisted, pointed to and resisted.
Right. Right. Yeah. I mean, there are a couple of political scientists, Joe Yasinski and Joe Parent, who start their book on conspiracy theories with the Declaration of Independence and read it as a conspiracy theory document.
Yeah. It was actually in the book Bernard Bailyn's, I think, Ideological Origins of the American Revolution.
Right.
Is that what that book is called?
Right.
There's a whole chapter in there on conspiracies and conspiracy theories in the revolutionary pamphlets and so forth.
Right. I think that there were a lot of historians, and starting in the early 60s in particular, who got very interested in conspiracy as a language, as a way to express anxiety throughout U.S. history, partly because of McCarthy, partly because of Barry Goldwater. Then in 1964, they started to see this right-wing language of conspiracy, and then they started to look back in U.S. history and say, where does this come from? And then say, wow, you can see this in all eras.
Yeah. Yeah.
And something that came up after 9/11 was that people were pointing out how war is really about money. And I remember people kind of pointing back to, Smedley Butler and the Merchants of Death. And you go through that too. But what I'm curious about is, what did they maybe get right and what did they get wrong? That accusation about the kind of the connection between, I think Smedley Butler, the way he puts it, that war is really about big business. What's right or wrong about that?
Well, certainly what's right is that there are a lot of corporations that make a lot of money from war, and that therefore they have an incentive to encourage war, not just the U.S. government, but abroad. And that's what the Munitions Committee, the Senator Nye's investigation in the mid-1930s was looking into, was they believed that there had been an actual conspiracy among bankers and arms manufacturers to trick the U.S. government into entering World War I. And they couldn't prove that. They couldn't prove that at any point there was ever, a meeting in the White House where the bankers and the DuPonts sat around with President Wilson and said, here, let's cut you a check for, stampeding the country into war. But what they did prove is that the DuPont Corporation and a lot of arms manufacturers made a lot of money out of the war. And that the bankers from the beginning wanted the U.S. to get into the war because they had a lot of ties to Britain, and they didn't want Britain to lose the war, which would have impacted them, their balance sheets.
Sure. Yeah, that makes sense. So the language is different. The details are different than that. The idea that it's just these big businesses, well, kind of like Oliver Stone's version of the JFK assassination, right? Is well, they were going to lose, the arms merchants were going to lose all this money, and he wanted to pull us out of Vietnam, and therefore they had him killed. And it's just oversimplification and zero evidence to talk about the causality or the intentionality behind that.
Right.
Dan, did you want to say something about that?
Well, one of the things you point to as well is World War I sort of marks the beginning of modern, at least, propaganda, wartime propaganda,
Mhm.
and it has close ties to the world of advertising,
Right.
which has modern advertising has late 19th century origins, I think, and so one of the things that one of the cultural elements that I think aids conspiracism is that we live in a culture saturated with advertising slash propaganda, which we know, whether we admit it or not, is largely lying to us. And so we live in a culture of lying, and maybe you could speak to, and maybe that's an exaggerated way to put it, but speak to the longer term influence of World War I propaganda slash advertising.
Well, I think that is a crucial point, is that during World War One, the government spent a tremendous amount of money on convincing the American people that it was necessary to sacrifice to fight the war. This is partly because that's how it was financed, was through a large part of it was people buying bonds to finance the war. So they needed to sort of whip people up into a frenzy on that. It's also because there were a lot of people who opposed the war because they were recent immigrants from the countries on the other side,
Hmm.
or because they were socialists or pacifists, and or just because they were in the middle of the country and they didn't see what the big deal was, why the United States had any interests on the other side of the Atlantic. So there's a lot of people who oppose the war. So the government then consults with journalists, with the advertising industry, to come up with this propaganda. With Hollywood, there are a lot of propaganda films in World War I. And so therefore, after the war, when people start to look back on it, they say, wow, we really were gullible. The government really sold us a bill of goods. And that contributes to the anti-war sentiment by the 1930s, contributes to the people who want to set up the Nye Committee. But it propaganda, of course, becomes an important tool of modern government from that point on. I think it's especially shocking in World War I because it's new and because it's rather crude by modern standards. But certainly it's used by governments in subsequent wars as well.
Right. There's a lot of that propaganda about the Germans mutilating people in Belgium and all that, right? Which just came straight out of,
Right.
yeah.
Well, and also uses sort of standard 18th and 19th century conspiracist tropes of, baby slaughter,
Yeah.
abuse of women, the sort of ultra cruel things that Catholics or Mormons or Jews are accused of.
Right.
Now, the Hun
Right.
is cast in that same mode, and those are very powerful ideas.
Right. Definitely.
So then, what Ben and I both discussed your book and been through it several times. He taught it, and I'm going to teach it next semester as well, and read it a third time in preparation for this discussion. And I keep trying to hone in um, on the kind of on the thesis. Even though I get the thesis, I'm learning new things each time, because I'm certainly seeing that there are reasons that when people learn the real history of the secrecy in the U.S. government, that could give them reason to believe that so-called they are out to get you, or what have you. But then there's this aspect over here, which is the exaggeration of it, or the jumping to conclusions without evidence part. And that's what I find, that gray area in there between what can actually be shown and then the leaping to the conclusion. The Garrison type of conclusions where there's 5 shooters on Dealey Plaza, right, or more. What do you think is causing these kinds of leaps? And we see that in each of the chapters that you cover too.
Well, I would say that there are always people who discover that there's money or power to be had if they exaggerate government conspiracies. So there's there's Joe McCarthy, right? I don't think he actually believes much of anything. He's a sheer opportunist who decides, okay, the way I'm going to get reelected, the way I'm going to get more power within the Senate is to accuse the Democratic agencies in the US government that are controlled by Democrats, like the State Department. I'm going to accuse them of being infested with Soviet spies. And then with Garrison, I think that he is trying to get attention, get a nationwide platform. And he's just the sort of person who always would fling around accusations like that. A modern example would be Alex Jones, is that Alex Jones started out in the 90s as really proposing left and right-wing conspiracy theories, and a lot of people found him amusing as opposed to terrifying. But then sometime in the 2000s, he discovered that there was a lot of money to be made in right-wing conspiracy theories. And so he got a lot more extreme, a lot more dangerous, and also made a lot more money.
Yeah, when thinking about conspiracy theories, one of the things I told my students is, that I don't know how old this saying is, but follow the money.
Right.
If you follow the money, there's often an entrepreneur working, whether they believe it or not. I mean, it sort of defies belief that Alex Jones could believe the things he says, but he says them because they're immensely profitable. And you can go back, depending on how you define profit. If you include sort of personal rewards, psychological rewards, there's always some sort of entrepreneurial spirit going on there in promoting conspiracy theories.
Right. No, I think that's very true. And if you start looking at people who spread conspiracy theories, there's either a political motive or a financial motive.
Right.
And it's interesting because you're using, Dan, the way you're using it is actually the follow the money idea is different than the way that the conspiracists follow the money, right? Which is, oh, well, someone is going to, was it qui bono, right? The
right.
saying, right? Who benefits?
Right.
Even the dude said that in The Big Lebowski, right? Who benefits? And then you can discover who's actually behind the conspiracy. But that came from Deep Throat in Watergate, though, right? But the movie, not in reality.
Right. And it's definitely a memorable scene in the movie. I'm not sure if Deep Throat actually said that to Woodward in reality or not.
Yeah,
but I mean,
I think not.
For a lot of investigations of various sorts, it's not bad advice. I mean, it's not a bad place to at least start. Like, follow the money. Who's profiting?
Right.
And I mean, on the individual conspiracy believer level, I mean, it's not necessarily monetary profit, but psychological well-being is a form of benefit, right?
Right.
Yeah, to feel like you're part of kind of privileged information.
Yeah.
I have to say, when you mentioned Alex Jones, I remember I received a videotape from a student who was a student of my wife's at a high school in Kansas right after 9/11. And he said, oh, you guys got to watch this. I put it in, and immediately I'm appalled by what he's saying. But so then I listened to one of his radio shows one time, and literally 2 minutes into it, somebody from Kentucky or some other place called up, and then his phone was going a little bit fuzzy, and he immediately jumped to the conclusion that the government is listening in on him. And it occurred to me, this guy, he really feels important now. He says, I got really important information. And Alex Jones was kind of encouraging him on that too. So that there must be that kind of an element there too.
Right. I mean, I think that's an element of clinical paranoia, is that you believe that people are out to get you because you're very important. It makes you feel important that the government is listening to my phone calls and reading my emails because I know the truth. And there's also a lot of people who want to believe in conspiracy theories because it's a community. So, for example, QAnon. Well, if you are part of the QAnon community, then you're all helping each other to decipher these clues, and you are the ones who know the truth. You have power, and you have, a group of friends on the internet that are helping you to expose the evildoers. And, that's a very exciting feeling.
Definitely.
One of the things that Chris has mentioned before is that it's important, and I think when Joe Ujinsky was here at Marshall in September, he also made a point of saying that really you can't think of people who believe in conspiracy theories as stupid or irrational. You have to have a good deal of empathy for them, because they are just humans trying to make it through a really complicated world. And
Right.
I think that's an important thing to keep in mind, not to dismiss conspiracy theorists, but rather try to figure out why they believe what they believe. And to me, I mean, my conclusion after teaching the class many, many times and having, a few hundred students cycle through it is it's an entirely human characteristic to believe in conspiracy theories.
Yeah.
Right, definitely.
Yeah, and actually, when you're talking about QAnon too, I remember seeing a documentary about it, maybe the HBO one, that where when you see the video of QAnon people on the screen, they're elated. They're talking about these horrible things, right? But they're not like charged up. It's different than, of course, at January 6th, right? They are angry there, but when they're actually online, they feel like they've received like this hidden wisdom, and now it's all clear. That must be, there's something biological and neurotransmitter associated with it. They're probably flooded with oxytocin because of the community they're with, and then serotonin and all these good feelings too that kind of perpetuates it. It'd be difficult to extract somebody from that kind of community.
Right. Right. I think also there's the thrill of solving a mystery. And you have all these clues and you put them together. You're the one who discovered this. And if there's a community of people, then collectively you do that. I mean, remember with Pizzagate, which is the predecessor of QAnon, really, they looked through all of John Podesta's emails and decided that when he said cheese pizza, he meant child pornography.
Yeah.
Now, how do you get there? But nevertheless, they were thrilled. They believed that they had decoded his secret messages, and so that was empowering for them.
They had the
It's
ability to decipher something that usually takes somebody years of training in the intelligence community to get to, right?
right, right,
They can feel
exactly,
big.
right. It's also a natural human tendency to search for patterns.
Mm.
So if you're shown a bunch of disconnected events, you want to connect them.
Yeah.
It's apparently we're hardwired that way to look for patterns and to look for meaning, and to not say, well, some 24-year-old loser just killed the president and changed the course of history. That's kind of terrifying. There's more solace in thinking, well, there are a group of evil people who planned it and got away with it. There's a purpose, at least if it's an evil purpose, but it's a purpose.
Yeah, definitely. Go ahead, Dan.
The to coin a phrase, the search for order,
Right.
the imposition of order on the world is a really powerful driver of conspiracism. Again, I'm sometimes hesitant to say this out loud, but conspiracism is very much akin to a religion. It provides a lot of the same personal satisfactions and orderliness and rules and community. And I don't know if you've seen, there's some, I believe there's psychologists are now talking about conspirituality,
Oh, no, I have not.
which is really a great new word that sort of gets at this idea that the psychological and to some extent sociological benefits of conspiracism are like religion. It's,
Hmm.
you know,
Oh my gosh.
I
Religion.
don't. I mean, I'm sorry, go ahead.
I was just going to say religion for a secular age.
Right. Yeah.
In an age when a lot of people have drifted away from organized religion, it perhaps gives them the same sorts of satisfactions that in earlier generations they would have gotten from the church.
Yeah. And I mean, you point to sort of growing distrust of the government, but I think, and I'd like to hear your thoughts on this. You see over the course of at least the second half of the 20th century, growing distrust, mistrust of all sort of major institutions. So how are those things related, do you think? The growing distrust of government and of other institutions.
I would say that there, I mean, just to be extremely general here, right?
Sure.
Since the 1970s in the United States, there's been rising inequality and greater gaps between rich and poor, and people are who are working class or lower middle class are especially angry that they feel like people are getting away with stuff. And so they feel like the democratic system is no longer working. And so they're looking for people to blame. And they're looking to try and understand that. And especially since 2008, there's distrust of the government, but also of the financial industry, of corporations, of big pharma, you name it, they're distrustful of it. And they're distrustful of Congress and the courts, as well as the president. And the media, of course, so that people are becoming more and more alienated and atomized and distrustful.
Yeah.
Yeah, I definitely hadn't even thought about it in those terms, but the book Deaths of Despair, which looks at kind of especially how things have changed in rural America in the past half century, that is associated with rising crime in some cases, but also domestic violence, alcoholism, suicides. It would seem like that kind of pairs along with Ushinsky's idea about conspiracy theories are for losers, right? Where you have a lot of people who have lost more recently, and therefore they might be more inclined towards that, because it's not that it's just in their imagination that their lives have gotten different, right? It's that they actually can see these indicators, these health indicators in particular, that are the result of a poor economic outcomes happening.
Right. Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. I mean, I think that a lot of the distrust of government has some basis in rational thinking.
Right.
Is that a lot of people are not being well served by their government at the moment, and so it makes sense for them to say, "Well, I just want to throw everyone out and start over again."
Yeah, which Trump provided in his rhetoric.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
And I mean, I think it says something about the broader culture. I don't think I'm prepared to say exactly what it says about it, that we have a category called deaths of despair. I mean, what,
Yeah.
how, those are some lost people, right? I mean, just not
Right.
being supported anywhere. That's kind of a depressing thought.
The book is incredibly depressing, but
Well,
the data are incredible, though. I think, and one of the authors won the Nobel Prize even in economics too. And but what's fascinating is that you do. I mean, I think they can all kind of tie in together. If you have an understanding of history, like you point out, there's this growing inequality in the country. Then that is based on an analysis over time, and a lot of people don't really see that happening in the present day, and so they're kind of reacting to what's happening to them right now. And to kind of go to this, I think the most important or most but there's two really big conspiracy theories that always come up in my classes. I don't know about with Dan if these are the two that came up, but definitely JFK and 9/11. Over and over again, people are bringing them up. Did you find that there were parallels in the way that people thought about that as a conspiracy theory, or differences?
Well, I would say that, yeah, there are a lot of parallels. They're both, you can see them both as intelligence failures. that there were, in both cases, signs that this disastrous event was going to happen, but they were ignored by the relevant officials. So you have a desire to find out, why did this happen and who is to blame? So that is common. I would say that also a similarity is that over time, well, not even just over a couple of years, a lot of people tend to look back at that event and say, well, I think that the people who are in charge now must have known, must have either deliberately ignored these signs or arranged it all from the beginning. So they're really very parallel conspiracy theories.
Right, like the lie hop and the my hop
Right,
differences.
right.
Right, let it happen on purpose, made it happen on
Right.
purpose.
I would say that the main difference is that the 9/11 theories, though, they sort of suffuse popular culture and all of our students are aware of them, they are not nearly as popular if you look at polls as the JFK theories.
Right.
So at their peak, 9/11 theories were believed by about 1/3 of the population, whereas JFK, it sometimes reached 80%.
Yeah.
Did you find that to be the case, Dan, in your classes?
I mean, those two came up, but so maybe not surprisingly, given where we are and when I was teaching the course, big pharma and medical community withholding cures so that they can make money on drugs that don't work and operations that don't work. The most shocking case, I had a student who was a cancer survivor who swore that his doctors were actually conspired against him and withheld cures so they could treat him for 2 years rather than 2 weeks. And my jaw just dropped. I didn't know what to say to the guy other than, so you think your doctors really wanted to kill you rather than cure you? And he said, yeah, pretty much.
Wow.
So,
Wow.
that's it, for a while, a few years ago, and Chris certainly knows more about this than I do. Huntington, West Virginia was the hot spot in the oxycodone death from overdose. I mean, I know it's still going on, but it was really intense here for a while. And so I think that influenced when I asked students what conspiracy theories they believed in or knew about. Big Pharma was bang right at the top of the list.
Yeah.
JFK, I think for younger people now is sort of faded. Like they don't know who he is. They know he was president, but they don't have any sense of loss.
Right.
So and even
doesn't
9/11
appeal to them as much.
even that 9/11 is sort of drifting into the past where it's sort of unknown. They were 2 years old when it happened. Or
No, you're right. And actually, now that I think about it, yeah, my students, that demographic isn't even interested in those kinds of conspiracy theories. It's more people that are closer to my age, the Gen X people,
Yeah,
and above.
yeah. Do you think that there are in the past federal government conspiracies that have gone undiscovered, or is it uh, or is it inevitable that, given the level of openness and the tendency of people to not keep secrets, that it's impossible to keep a government conspiracy secret?
I'm sure that there have been conspiracies. I mean, it depends on how you define a conspiracy, right?
Yeah.
So I'm sure that there have been, CIA operations that we still don't know about. As far as like domestic, that I don't know. It would probably be harder to keep that kind of secret, but I'm not sure. Um, I also think that over time, it's more likely, of course, that a secret will be revealed.
Sure.
So, for example, we didn't know about Operation Northwoods for 35 years after it was proposed. So, and that's really because of the Oliver Stone movie led to Congress to demand that a lot more of the documents about the JFK assassination be revealed. So that took decades. We're just, I don't know if you know about the Chenault affair. This is a 1968 election that the Nixon campaign was alleged to secretly contact the government of South Vietnam and convince them not to join the peace talks. There's a historian, John Farrell, I think his name is, who just wrote a book a couple years ago where he discovered more evidence to support that theory. So, 50 years afterwards, he discovers this information. So I think that over time, there is certainly a tendency for secrets to be revealed.
Yeah, I agree. And like the Chenault affair, that's a good example of how, a lot of this has to do with personal relationships too, right? Because President Tu had to agree to what Anna Chenault was trying to propose, and this is in her interest as well. And who knows if it was in Tu's interest? He
Right.
was pretty obstinate in the years later on to negotiate at all with the communist side. So he might not have been ready. Maybe it was a general, so he might have wanted to hold on to power. But certainly that's something that was secretive, and it would have been difficult to reveal if it hadn't been for everything that happened afterwards, right?
Right.
Yeah. And I always bring up Watergate, though, too. I was just talking about this this morning in one of my classes, that if people think that the CIA and the FBI are so good at doing major things, just look at Watergate, where the CIA operatives literally, like, they got caught by a minimum wage night watchman because they put duct tape on the door, and and they were caught red-handed with all this money too, and and like with the assassinations, they didn't succeed in any of their assassinations. Like they couldn't get to Castro, they couldn't get to Lumumba in time. So the idea that they're this very secretive and good at it, they're not the KGB, you know.
Right. Yeah. No, the Watergate thing that inspired a lot of conspiracy theories that, in fact, the burglars wanted to get caught because they were part of a conspiracy, because it is incredibly incompetent to think that they
Yeah.
would put duct tape on the door and put it on horizontally so you're just walking past and you see it.
Right.
So
That's right. It
they
could be
were
seen from the parking garage.
Yeah.
they were purposefully incompetent.
Right. Right.
Oh, I
That's the
love
I
theory.
hadn't heard
Love
that
that.
one.
Yeah,
Yeah. What else explains it, right?
Right.
that's right.
Wow. That's I guess the made it happen on purpose.
Right.
But to yourself though, that's different than I hadn't heard that one before. Yeah, but makes sense. And kind of moving closer to this, I guess is do you think that these reports, like the Warren Commission report, like the 9/11 Commission report, like the one that happened after World War I, do you think these are efforts on the part of the government? Well, not the one after World War I, but especially Warren and 9/11. Do you think these are actually fueling the conspiracy theories?
Well, I think so. I think that they certainly open up a space for people to, first of all, follow the commissions very carefully and object to the people who are on them and believe that they're a conspiracy, a cover up from the beginning, and then afterwards to say, aha, I told you so, and then to use the information that was provided to the commission to then support their own conspiracy theories. On the other hand, if I were advising a government official, would I say, don't appoint a commission because it'll just fuel the conspiracy theories? No, I would not say that, because I do think we get important information from these investigations.
But like you point out with LBJ, right? He approaches Warren and the others because he's trying to say, I want to make sure that
Right.
that it's not a conspiracy that's connected to the communists, right? To Cuba and the Russians.
Right.
And he says, just to Russell, right? He says that you're just trying to confirm what the FBI said. So if they would have just let the FBI report stand,
Right.
makes you
Right.
it
No,
just makes
that's
me
true.
wonder, yeah.
And political conspiracies need an official story to be in opposition to. And
Right.
so if you don't have an official story, it's sort of hard to form the counter story.
Right. I mean, certainly, I think a lot of people have argued that Barack Obama should not have released his long form birth certificate because over time, the numbers actually went up after that. But it's a very hard thing to do, I think, when you're faced with those conspiracy theories, is where they keep saying, just release it, just release it. Why can't we see the birth certificate? So that you finally just say, okay, here's the birth certificate. Because you then think that that will inoculate yourself against it. But in fact, what happens is people say, aha, well, now he's released the fake birth certificate. So this proves that he wasn't born here.
Yeah.
It's incredible. Yeah. Because it's not really about the proof that they're looking for. There's something, and that's a
Right.
whole other conversation about that. But
Yeah.
gosh.
Yeah.
And
I'm sorry.
yeah, go ahead, Dan.
Chris.
Yeah.
Let me ask sort of a big scale question here that might be unfair. To what extent do you think that we live in a culture of conspiracy? That is, and maybe what you think is we don't at all, but to what extent do you think sort of modern Western culture lends itself to conspiracism, or is fertile ground for conspiracism?
In the sense that in modern society, we are always looking for answers, for collusion, for plots and patterns. Is that what you're saying?
Yeah.
Well, that's an interesting question. I mean, certainly, I think Gordon Wood made that argument in an article about modern conspiracy theories emerge essentially with the French Revolution,
Right.
that it is a product of modernity, if you want to call the French Revolution modern, right?
Yeah.
And I think that's an interesting meta point there. I think looking at US history, I think that certainly you can see as the government gets more powerful in the 20th century, you get more anti-government conspiracy theories. So to that degree, you could say that it is an inevitable byproduct of government expansion and consolidation.
Yeah. Many conspiracy theories, I think, are critiques of bigness.
Mhm.
In that it's almost always an elite group
Right.
conspiring.
Right.
And I've been struck in talking to students in particular, how they often won't take the leap to directly criticizing, say, modern consumer capitalism as a system, because that's sort of forbidden territory. You can't. That makes you a communist, right? If you
Right.
critique capitalism, but you can do so by attacking big pharma or thinking badly about big pharma or big business or big tech or big whatever.
Uh-huh.
So they're sometimes not very subtly veiled critiques of large scale forces like capitalism or like organized religion.
Right. Well, I would say also that, throughout the world, not just in the United States, that democracy is under siege, and that that sense that we are living through a time when ordinary people don't have power, when the climate could kill us in just a few decades, the sense of doom and dystopia certainly feeds conspiracy theories, a sense of powerlessness.
Yeah. At the same time, we're in an age of sort of radical individualism too, where we're supposed to be powerful. We're supposed to brand ourselves and be
Right.
entrepreneurial. And I actually had a brief conversation on Twitter, unfortunately, with a guy who was promoting leadership. And I said, well, what the hell does that, what do you even mean by that? He said, you start by leading yourself. I was like, wow, like what does that mean? But I mean, those sorts of ideas that you yourself are responsible for being the best you can be, and yet, as you just say, you're powerless.
Right.
So you're sort of stuck. You're stuck.
Yeah, maybe you can
It's
feel
depressing.
empowered. You can feel empowered, but and not depressed if you have a conspiracy theory that kind of explains it all, right? At least then you can kind of move forward and feel like you understand something at least. Whereas I oftentimes feel like I actually kind of prefer the confusing realm, so that I'm encouraged to read more books.
Yeah, yeah,
Um,
yeah,
like, and here's a way to segue into your next book. Um,
yeah.
I
I'd
was
like to
going to
hear about that.
say, I was initially thinking that we could talk about your latest book, the newspaper. Sorry, I'm going to get
Access.
newspaper Axis, right? But it's such a big topic. I was wondering if you wouldn't mind if we had another episode that actually delved into that, because there's 6 major media people that are involved in that, and it's a huge topic, but fascinating.
Of course, yeah,
Great.
I'd be happy to.
So
Could
thanks
you
so much.
give us now the 90-second version of your new work, or the 4-minute version, like whatever version's appropriate?
Yeah.
I'd like to
Right.
hear about it.
Yeah.
Okay. Yes. Well, I look at the 6 most powerful media barons in the US and the UK in the 1930s and early 1940s.
Okay.
And they were all newspaper publishers, because that was the way most people got their news back then. And all of them were unalterably opposed to their governments taking a strong stand against the Nazis. So they were mostly conservatives domestically, but they also, but there were some exceptions. However, they all shared the same foreign policy beliefs, which is that the United States and Great Britain should turn a blind eye to whatever the Germans were doing in Europe, that it was not any of their business. And so as a result, they really pressured their respective governments to be slow in resisting the Nazis, and made it much more difficult, in particular in the United States, for Franklin Roosevelt to take a stronger stance earlier. So,
Wow,
in,
wow.
in the United States, the major figure is William Randolph Hearst. But then there were also a trio of cousins: Robert McCormick, Joe Patterson, Sissy Patterson. And in the UK, I look at Lord Rothermere of the Daily Mail and Lord Beaverbrook of the Daily Express. Now, all 6 of those together reached about 60 million people in the 2
Wow.
countries.
Wow.
I'm curious, were you involved at all with the Ken Burns and Lynn Novak project on the U.S. and the Holocaust?
No, I wasn't. I was
They
not.
should have talked to you, because they, I don't know if you've seen it. Have you seen it?
No, I've read about it, and I have decided not to watch it yet, but
Oh,
I've
okay,
read about
yeah.
it.
But because it does address just the kind of the political pressure that FDR felt, that he didn't want to come across as too pro-Jewish, right, during that time.
Uh-huh.
Um, uh, it's funny that, yeah, this one just came out, and then your book just came out too around the
Right,
same time.
right.
Yeah,
I should see it.
yeah. And yeah, it'd be a good tie-in with Daniel Okrent's book as well, The Guarded Gate, looking at kind of the way that people are thinking about, intellectuals are thinking about Jews and Catholics at the turn of the century, although that precedes what you're talking about, but still kind of ties in as well. Well, yeah, Dan, do you have any other questions? Because I'm sure we can keep going. Wanted to. Okay, that's fine.
I mean, I could, but
Yes, definitely.
We're at an hour plus now, I think, right?
There you go. Yeah, and so yeah, definitely we could talk another time about this book. It's fascinating. I encourage people
Sounds
to
very
go out and
interesting.
get it. Yeah, the newspaper Axis by Kathryn S. Olmsted, as well as Real Enemies, or any of the other books that she's written, would be a great idea too. So thanks so much for being with us out there from Davis, California.
All
Dr.
right. Thank you
Olmsted,
very
yeah,
much for having me.
you bet. And thanks, Dan, for being with us again
Sure,
as well.
sure. Have you stopped recording?
Not yet. I will.
Okay, all right. As I think I saw that